Why play Dynamo? Well, you might be having flexible items and good econ within a game that you want to play a different comp that's maybe a little bit less standard. You want to play a high cap level 8 comp where you're primarily rolling on level 8 but can also cap really high getting to level 9. Or you have a really good spot for reroll because Dynamo actually has multiple different cost rerolls incorporated in addition to having the potential to play around like a flexible 4 cost style line. Or you have an emblem or another enabler that kind of leans you into the Dynamo trait. However, you need to hit certain 4 and 5 costs. A lot of the times these boards are not very stable unless you hit like the chase 5 cost unit Aurora, or you're playing around a solid reroll spot. It's either or. If you're playing it in the more flexible level 8 style comp, you need those certain units in order to stabilize because it's very weak without the upgrades. But if you are playing with reroll, then you need to have a good spot for the reroll, very obviously. And additionally, it can also fizzle out with bad item quality. The items matter a lot with this comp, and there's a little bit of a sum of its parts going on in a lot of the different variations, so making sure that you properly itemize your units will give you the maximum potential for playing around the trait. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. We're getting close to our 10,000 sub goal RP giveaway. This helps me out as a smaller TFT content creator. If you watch my content and you like some of my previous videos, more guides are going to be coming out. This is a daily TFT channel where I try and do a guide per day to try and help you with your set 14 experience. So if you're liking that style of YouTube content, make sure to check out some of my other videos as well. But now let's go into the trait. So what is Dynamo? If we read the Dynamo trait, every 3 seconds, your team gains mana, and then Dynamos gain 100% more. So basically, whatever the numbers are listed, the Dynamo units will gain double the mana. So Dynamo is a really great splash trait. A lot of really strong comps actually just like to have 2 Dynamo just thrown in there because it helps generate mana for your whole team. Mana is the way that your units cast their ults or their main active abilities, and when they do that, that's usually a large chunk of damage or tankiness or other stuff. It's like the main reason that the units are who they are is their abilities that they can cast. So with the Dynamo trait, you get that already, but playing around the actual Dynamo units, they generate a lot of mana on their own. It actually makes for a very flexible style of comp because if you play deep into the Dynamo trait, the Dynamo units are going to be casting their abilities very often without the extra need of items to generate mana a lot of the times, and that actually puts them in a really powerful and convincing spot to basically just pump out damage continuously a lot of the time. So that's basically the trait. We're going to talk about the units themselves in a little bit, but when we're thinking about the trait and we're thinking, when should I play around Dynamo? So Dynamo, I already talked about, it's a really nice splash trait. You kind of try and fit it into a lot of different boards, of course, but there are some spots where you might lean yourself more towards the Dynamo trait, and a lot of times that comes down to your items. If you have very flexible items, playing around vertical Dynamo works out really well because there are multiple units that have different types of itemizations, right? You have a mixture of AD and AP units, you have a mixture of reroll and non-reroll units that can use a lot of items. Of course, if you're playing towards any of the reroll lines, having the particular conditions for the reroll lines is really strong. Both the reroll lines that are primarily played right now are around the lower cost unit Morgana or around the 3 cost unit Elise. Both of these units really like to have blue buff. Even though they are the Dynamo trait, blue buff helps out a lot with them casting because they're very low mana units, and it also has really good stats, really good effects. So a lot of times blue buff is going to be essential if you're trying to play any of the reroll lines. If you're not playing the reroll lines, then having a wide variety of items and flexible items to itemize multiple backline carries is going to be very powerful because you're going to have a lot of units casting their ults. Additionally, a Dynamo emblem, often if you have Dynamo emblem, it's one of the strongest emblems. It's made with a frying pan, has a really powerful effect that we're going to talk about later. So there's lots of variations of this comp that you can play if you have a Dynamo emblem. Even though, 4 Dynamo isn't something to like carry home about as being like, the Giga Prismatic that you instantly win the game, having a Dynamo emblem playing deep into the trait actually helps out a lot with a lot of different boards, and it gives a really powerful ability of just stacking damage amp on a unit. Additionally, there are lots of augments that can help. Of course, for your low cost rerolls, anything that helps with reroll could be a really good enabler for you. A lot of the stuff like no scout, no pivot, things like that, anything that like zoops up your low cost units is going to be really powerful. But additionally, there is an augment called Memory Bank, which basically if your units spend mana, you gain a Jin and a Morgana. If they keep spending mana, you will then get Azania's and an Aurora eventually. It's actually not that hard to cash out because they actually give you the Jhin and the Morgana, so you can start off with 2 Dynamo, and if you can get them to just like exist and have very stall heavy comps in your mid game, you will cash out the chase unit for the comp, which is an Aurora, with a really good Ornn artifact that fits really well on the team, Azania's Paradox. So you have this really strong augment that usually is like a really big, like, you know, alarm bells I can play around this comp. This will be a really cool and interesting game. And then there's other stuff like Rig Shop, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Different things that can enable you either for the reroll lines or for playing around those level 8 4-cost style comps. So now, let's talk about some final boards. Before we do so, I like to just introduce and talk about each of the units. So first of all, Morgana. I'm sure everybody knows about Morgana because she was super dominant in the last patch, and you know, everybody kind of knows she's a little bit annoying. There was that one comp that we're going to talk about in this video as well, and I'm going to give you the breakdown of it. But Morgana, she basically hits the target and then the nearest non-hack target and then does damage over time, dot damage, which is really important, really powerful. So she's really good if you have a nice stalling style comp that she just eventually ticks down and deletes units by spreading her hack or her damage ability. Next you have Jhin. So one important thing about Jhin is that he does a little bit of sundering, which means he has an armor reduction effect. So if you're doing AD damage, having a Jhin on your board is usually really nice. And then he does this thing where he bounces a little bullet and it hits like extra units, and he does a large amount of physical damage. Then you have Elise. Another thing to note is that Elise has not strictly a shred effect, but she has an a magic resist reduction effect. So if you're playing around AP damage, she has an ability that can reduce some of their magic resist to make your AP units a little bit more effective. So as you can see in this comp, you actually have 2 utility style units that give you some utility of reducing armor and magic resist to optimize your damage a little bit without having to make those items. You still have to make them to optimize, of course, right? You make the completed items because they don't sunder or shred to the full ability of an item, of course. But what I'm saying is it's actually really powerful because it helps you to stabilize a lot earlier. Then you have Misfortune. She's like the main 4-cost carry. She basically shoots these waves of bullets and she just does like huge spread damage across the board. And then you have Aurora, which is the chase unit. She summons a unit on your bench and then she just like jumps out and just like does massive damage to multiple units. So extremely powerful. When we're thinking about playing around vertical Dynamo, the main comp that you would think of if you're trying to play around a level 8 style comp, so non-reroll, is Dynamo with Vanguard. So if you look at this board and you squint a little bit with your eyeballs, you'll kind of like, you know, it's like, it looks almost like Vanguard Marksman. And that's true. It's very similar, except the itemizations are going to be a little bit different. The main carry with this comp a lot of times is going to be your Misfortune. Usually if you're playing around this variation, you're playing around Misfortune carry, but this is a little bit of a sum of its parts. So Misfortune with 4 Dynamo backline, and then usually you're playing 4 Vanguard frontline. You play Braum because Braum's going to help with the Syndicate for your MF, and then you usually just play an extra Darius to add in the Syndicate bonus. If you look at this board, it looks like it's a level 9 board, and that's because it is. I will talk a little bit about who to drop at what points if you're playing around level 8, but let's talk a little bit about the itemizations and the units. So here, we're playing MF, Elise, Morgana, and Aurora. Usually you drop the Jhin because he's the one that you care the least about typically. Morgana gives Divinicorp, which helps with some of the like Divinicorp bonuses, so she's usually a little bit more valuable than Jhin in a lot of cases. Usually you're trying to stabilize around Elise and MF as your dual carries. So, you know, MF, in terms of your MF items, you actually just want to have her do as much damage as possible. You don't really care about giving her mana generation because she's just better off as an AD unit just doing burst damage, and with 4 Dynamo, you're actually going to have a decent chance of getting those casts off anyways. So you just want her to like absolutely nuke and delete the board. So often it's just IE and Striker's Flail / Guard Breaker. It got recently changed, so I'm going to say both names until we're familiar with everything. But basically the way this works is Infinity Edge gives you a bunch of crit chance, makes it so that your abilities critically strike. Then Striker's Flail gives you damage amp based on your critical strikes, and it also raises your critical strike chance, so there's a good chance that her ult is going to be a crit. And then with the damage amp, you basically just multiply her damage in a very meaningful way. The last item, a lot of times you just put either more damage amp, something like a Giant Slayer. You can put more AD. If you're not playing Jhin on your board because you found an Aurora, then you can also go for Last Whisper and spread out some utility items. She also hits like multiple units, so even stuff like a red buff can work out well because she's going to spread that wounding effect very well by just like deleting the backline. So the last item, very flexible, lots of different options, but a lot of times you're just going for like a crit style build, i.e. Guard Breaker or i.e. Striker's Flail, and then +1 item. Just for sake of example here, I'm going to put Giant Slayer because it's a flexible item. Now, in terms of Elise, there's many different Elise paths. You can go a very similar build. A lot of times you actually do like to have blue buff. Blue buff does give a good amount of stats, and it gives like the starting mana, and the extra mana you get after casting actually has really good synergy with like Dynamo and all of that, so she's pretty powerful. And then with the takedown, she also gets a little bit of damage amp from it, so it's just a good item. Typically blue buff, if there's a blue buff holder, they like to have blue buff, so don't think of it too much of like mana generation with Dynamo is bad, but like I said, you don't necessarily need the blue buff because you're gonna have a lot of mana generation with the Dynamo, so you could go for 3 damage items, but typically when I build Elise, I'll go for something like blue buff. And then if you can scale her up, like Gunblade Archangels is a common build, just because if you have enough frontline, then this Elise just like slowly ramps up with the Archangels, and then just heals everybody, and then just drops nukes and does like an insane amount of damage. Like I said, you could also just go for upfront damage similar to like the MF. You can go for like a Jewel Gauntlet Guard Breaker, and in some cases you can even drop the blue buff, and you can even play like a different style of item, but lots of different opportunities, lots of different options there. Morgana we're going to talk about later, because I'm actually going to talk about the Morgana reroll line like after this, so don't worry, we'll go into much depth about that line if you're here for that. Aurora, a lot of times, if you don't have an Elise 3-star, even if you have an Elise 3-star, as soon as you hit Aurora, you're often better just putting the items on, the Aurora 2, I mean. If you have Elise 3-star, then obviously keep your items on Elise, but a lot of times, like, you're going to be playing this on level 8, and if you don't have a good spot for reroll, you're just going to have, like, an Elise 2. As soon as you hit a single copy of Aurora, I think you just move the items onto Aurora. She just does insane amounts of damage, but it's debatable either way, right? You can go whichever one. If you have better items for the Elise, like blue buff, obviously, then triple item your Elise, and you'll be in a good spot. If you have Elise 3, obviously keep the Elise 3 itemized, but as soon as you start to have like Aurora 2, she recently got buffed. I think she's really reliable. You can actually transfer the items, especially if it's like Elise to Aurora 2, just move them over to the Aurora. That's typically the ebb and flow of this comp. And then of course you have Jhin, which usually you're playing in place of Aurora if you hit that instead. Now, in terms of your front line, I'm actually just going to remove Jhin for a second, just because on final board, you typically don't play the Jhin. Your board looks something like this, and then if you can find Aurora items, you find the Aurora items. When you're playing this variation, it's actually a little bit confusing on level 8. Basically, if you're playing main carry MF with this comp, like you're playing MF2 and you have AD items and you're playing around this MF, then you really want to have Syndicate in. Syndicate gives extra HP to your Syndicate units, and it also has a Kingpin bonus with like the damage amp that you get. So it actually gives a lot of value to the MF. Additionally, when you play this comp, you also have Braum, which could work as a really strong frontline until you have some other frontline upgrades. If you can find the Aurora early, then I think it's beneficial to play around, like, you know, obviously like the Leona as your main tank, because she gets the Anima squad, and then she's also just really, really strong as a frontline unit. In terms of your tank items, just try and build Giga tank items. HP goes a long way because it's really good on Leona. It's also pretty good on Braum because he scales really well, his shield off of HP. So HP items like Warmogs, those are going to help you out a little bit more, but of course, just as many tank items as you can muster are going to be good just to itemize your tanks. On level 8, if you have MF and you're playing mostly around the MF as your main carry, you can actually drop the 4 Vanguard and play, often you play a Gragas instead, so you'll basically just play like, you know, you won't play this dude, but you'll basically just play like a board that looks something more like this, like you'll put in Gragas for Bruiser, or you'll just play 3 Vanguard, just because like you want to have Syndicate in. MF Syndicate bonus is basically she fires extra waves, so more bullets, and it actually can work out to be a lot of damage, especially if you have the Dynamo trait in and you can like scale up multiple Dynamo. A lot of times you might also end up without an Aurora. In that case, you could also drop to 3 Dynamo and not play the Jhin. I don't like this as much, but for Vanguard, if you're in need of the front line, this can actually work out well. There is quite a big jump from 3 to 4 Dynamo, like the 4 mana is actually pretty meaningful, and it makes it like significantly more effective as a trait. So you want to try and rush to get 4 Dynamo in as much as possible. That's why this comp, in my opinion, is not something that you usually aim towards unless you hit like an Aurora early. Whenever you're playing this 4 Vanguard, 4 Dynamo variation, you can find yourself very much in the weeds if you don't easily make it to level 9. So you want to play this comp relatively uncontested, and you also want to play this comp from having a good spot. So on your roll down, a lot of times I'll angle towards this comp if I have items that I'm maybe playing like another comp. Let's say I'm playing like Vanguard Marksman, for example, and I'm making IE and AD items, and then I get some AP items, or I'm playing around Elise as a reroll option, which we'll talk about in a second, and then I'm just trying to cap out my board late game, which ends up being like this type of board towards the later parts of the game. I wouldn't necessarily angle this comp if I don't have items for both MF Elise or MF Aurora, and I also wouldn't necessarily consider this comp as being like my main go-to comp unless I hit the Aurora. A lot of times I end up playing this comp, like me personally, when I play this comp, is when I'm angling Vanguard Marksman, and this is a flexible pivot option where I see an Aurora. Because if I see the Aurora, and MF is usually pretty easy to find on our level 8 roll down, I get MF2, I get Aurora, I go right to level 9, I'm relatively stable with a Leona 1, I have good front line, and then on level 9, I can fit in the whole board because then I don't have to compromise. I get 4 Vanguard in, my front line super stable, super strong, I have Anima in with the Aurora, and then I also have Syndicate in, which just helps out my whole board as a whole, excuse me. But anyways, if we're trying to play around reroll lines, there is a variation of this where you play around Elise reroll. Elise reroll, typically what you would do is you would be rolling on level 7, and you go for Elise 3 and Braum 3. Your items when you're playing Elise 3, Braum 3, a lot of times you play for the stall heavy Elise version, which is Archangel's Gunblade, and it just heals and like does a shit ton of damage. But you could go for upfront damage, like I was saying before. Both builds are totally fine, but typically your Elise items look something like this, or at least that's the way that I usually play it if I'm playing the reroll variation only. When you're playing the reroll variation, at this point you care a lot about the Braum 3, and in many cases when you play Syndicate, you actually Syndicate bonus the Braum. Just so here I'm just using this as the indicator of the hat bonus. Braum Syndicate bonus, he basically gets extra resistances, and then he also does extra bonus magic damage based on resistances and HP. So it's actually very effective to give that to him to make him like a Giga Tank. So if you're rerolling this variation, it's actually extremely strong, and this is a way to cap very high with it. If you remember when I was talking about the boards as well, that's why I mentioned Rig Shop. I think this comp works really nicely with Rigged Shop, at least the times that I tried it out, because Rigged Shop, you know, you're able to roll for those 3 costs on a higher level a lot of times. You can go level 8, and you can stay on level 8, roll for your regular board like MF, Leona, Aurora, have good odds for Aurora or decent odds for Aurora, but then also still be able to cap out really high around Elise 3 and Braum 3. These are situations that I think are a little bit better for the comp, but like I said, if you start the game off with a lot of Elises and you want to play towards something that could cap very high, this is another variation where you go primarily for Elise 3. I would argue that this is the strongest, highest cap version of this comp, so even if you're not necessarily Elise rerolling, it makes sense to hold on to Elises as you're playing around this comp. So now, in terms of other variations, I just want to mention really quickly, if you're playing around Elise reroll, similarly, you could also play this variation. This is a Nitro variation where you're just playing Nitro. Instead of playing around the low-cost Nitro units, you instead roll on level 7. You roll for Shyvana 3 and Elise 3, and then you just play around this. If you have a good Exotech item, you could play the extra Exotech units just to make sure that you have an extra frontline item, but this is usually limited to having a good Nitro spot, and then when you push levels, you just stack in more Dynamos in order to cap out really high on a 4 Dynamo, 4 Nitro with the Giga units, and this is one of the highest cap versions of Nitro because Elise is a really strong early game and late game unit. Now, let's talk about the last main Dynamo variation, which is going to be Morgana reroll. If you stuck around this long, I'm sorry. I think a lot of you might just really want to see this one, but it's also a little bit of an old comp. It kind of dominated the last patch, and it's still good this patch, so, you know, most of us know how to play around it, but I'll talk about it all the same. Usually this is a 1-cost reroll comp. As you can see, I just have a bunch of slathering units everywhere, but typically you're going to play around 6 Bastion as your primary thing, and then you try and go for 6 Bastion and 2 Dynamo, and then you put in more Dynamos as you level up. It makes sense to play Jhin in these cases if you have a good Exotech tank item. You don't really care about itemizing or going for Jhin 3, so if you don't have a good Exotech item, then don't play the Jhin, and instead you can play Elise, even go for Elise 3 in some situations. But of course, if you hit an Aurora, then you would always just replace both of them for Aurora because she's just so good. When you're playing around this comp, 6 Bastion works wonders because you're basically trying to stall for this Morgana to do a shit ton of damage. Morgana items, you always need to have blue buff Gunblade. Gunblade helps it so that she just heals up everybody and stalls out really long. Blue buff helps her to cast, and it's just really important for her to basically chain cast and get this effect proccing on as many units as possible because you want to start ticking them down with your hack ability. Additionally, your last item, I see lots of different variations. If it's early in the game and you have anti-heal, it can work really well because she spreads the anti-heal really well. But typically you go for like a large amount of damage. Something like a Jewel Gauntlet works well. Just make her ult crit and just have those ticks do a lot of extra damage. Or you can just play for larger AP. So like, of course, like something like Rabadons could work really well in a lot of cases. So always keep that in mind. But usually it's blue buff Gunblade, and then last item being whatever damage item you can muster. With this comp, a lot of times you'll also roll for Poppy 3 and Jax 3. Jax 3, I'm going to be honest, doesn't matter that much. You don't have to worry too much about wasting gold on Jax 3 if you're far away from Jax 3. So we'll just put him to the side. But just note, just for efficient rolling, you can roll for all of these 1 costs at a level 4 or level 5 at your low level intervals. Poppy, however, this unit is fucking ridiculous. Holy shit. Like, if you do not, like, this Poppy is, like, I swear, she is so critical to this version of the comp. So whenever you see a unit like Morgana, let me explain. Morgana is ticking down lots of units and doing a little bit of damage over time to everybody. She's spreading damage to the whole board. She's not necessarily killing the whole board. They can heal up, they can like survive, but she is applying damage to the whole board. Usually when you have a unit that applies damage to the whole board, you need another unit that also like goes and finishes the job, right? Because Morgana isn't that broken. She's not broken enough that she like casts and the whole board dies and like, you know, falls to their knees and just like it's over, right? A lot of times late game, that could be Aurora, right? Morgana will spread damage, and then Aurora, if you have an Aurora 2, she just jumps at the back line, just deletes them and finishes them off. For most of the game, the unit that actually finishes them off a lot of the times is this Poppy unit. This Poppy is ridiculous. So basically what Poppy does is she throws this buckler. And I remember I ranted about what a buckler is. Apparently a buckler is a shield, which makes no fucking sense to me, but whatever. She throws a shield at somebody and it just one-shots them, right? Her actual ability scales off of armor. So it scales off armor and AP. But the armor is actually massive scaling. So a lot of times when you're playing around this comp, you really want to have an armor item on this Poppy, and you also want to position the Poppy approximately on the side of the main carry. So you either want to position, I'm going to move these out of the way just so you can see it. You want to position the Poppy here or here often, right? Here or here. And the idea is that if you have a full board, let's just pick a random backline carry. Let's take MF because it's topical, right? But let's say that they have their MF and their MF's over here, right? The Poppy will shoot this buckler 4 units away. The furthest enemy within 4 hexes, 1, 2, 3, 4. As you can see, if they put their unit in the corner, you put the Poppy here. The Poppy's gonna throw this thing at this MF, and she's not gonna die. So the Poppy's not gonna die. And what's gonna happen is this Poppy is gonna keep throwing this shield, or whatever you call it, at the MF, this buckler, until the MF is dead. And then once the enemy carry is dead, trust me, your whole board's gonna be fine. And not only do you have to deal with the Poppy doing damage, the Morgana is still ticking damage on your whole board. So she's gonna eventually hit the backline units anyways and do a bunch of damage. So the two of them together is obnoxious. So if you're playing against this board, you have to dodge the Poppy always, right? But it becomes like this game of cat and mouse. You're basically trying to position your Poppy either here or over here in order to try and snipe wherever the backline carry is, because you're going to be 4 hexes away. You could obviously move it in a different spot, of course. You could put her more in the middle, of course. But this is a big part of this comp, is positioning your Poppy correctly. Additionally, not only do you have to worry about the Poppy hitting the backline, this comp is pure cheese. You have Sejuani, which has an ult that stuns, and you also have Galio, which does this other shit. I forget what it is. He summons a whirlwind within 3 hexes that deals damage and stuns. So if you don't have to worry about the Poppy dealing damage, this guy also deals damage and he stuns. So you know what your positioning looks like a lot of the time? It looks like this. You have Sejuani somewhere over here stunning everybody. You have this dude sniping the backline. You have this dude sniping and stunning the backline. And then you have Morgana while all this is going on. She's just healing and doing passive damage to everybody. This comp is obnoxious. It's not broken, right? It's still beatable. These things aren't like absurd. A lot of this comp's power is in positioning. So if somebody is paying attention to you and you're not moving your units around, if they just put their carry on the opposite side, it eliminates like so much of the powerfulness of this comp. So that's just something important to note. But the main thing I want to get to, we talked a little bit about positioning, but I just wanted to explain that because I think a lot of people neglect the Poppy in this comp, at least when I present it before and in the past, as well as when I watch my ranked games. I recently just, like, did my passing through of like Diamond and Masters relatively. Just every time I see people playing this comp when I was doing my rank up journey, nobody was ever like properly positioning or itemizing their Poppy. They were kind of more focused on just like having Bis Morgana and making sure their Morgana was broken. And I think that that's fair, but I just want to make sure that when I'm making this guide that you guys understand this Poppy is a very key component to this comp as well. And because of that, a lot of times you'll see people make things like Bramble Vest or even Protector's Vow, where you want to make like some sort of chainmail related item a lot of the time for the Poppy, because the chainmail items will scale up that buckler damage that she throws to the backline that will actually do a lot of damage and help out quite a bit. So just keep that in mind and be very careful. That's a really important fact about playing this comp, really important, and I just want to make it very clear when I went through it with everybody. Also, if we want to go back to the regular variation of Vanguard Marksman, like this one that I was talking about, if you're talking about positioning with this one as well, sometimes MF actually makes sense to not put the MF in the corner. And a lot of times you'll see the MF kind of be in here or here. It's just to give her a better angle on her firing, right? You either want to put the MF, a lot of times, excuse me, let me just do full board again. MF, because she does like this thing where she shoots these waves, a lot of times it benefits for you to put the unit either on opposite side of an enemy carry, right? You want to put the MF on the opposite side so that she's like hitting her waves and some of the damage is passively making it to the back line, or you put her kind of somewhere in the middle where she's then hitting like a wide variety of the units, like the angle is just a little bit better so she can hit like, more of the units. So a lot of times you'll see positioning where it's like MF is like not directly in the corner but like one off from the corner, and that's just something you have to decide. Obviously, the closer you put this MF to the middle, she might have more effective power on her ults because she's hitting more units, but she's also more susceptible to dying because she's in the center, she's not tucked away in the corner. So you have to use your judgment and you have to try your best to figure that one out for yourselves. Additionally, like I said, this comp, there's a lot of moving parts to it. So when you talk about Dynamo, I also want to mention how powerful the Dynamo Emblem is and talk about some variations with an emblem now. So Dynamo Emblem, if you read its ability, on cast, 1.5 damage amp per 10 mana spent. This is massive. When you have a unit that's casting a bunch, especially if you're playing around Vertical Dynamo, they will be casting a lot. It gives a lot of effective value. So you get a lot of damage amp from this emblem. It's one of the best emblems I think you can make. It's one of the most efficient emblems. No matter how many Dynamo you're playing, it just works to be like as powerful, if not more powerful, than most items you can make in the game. It is very strong. It gives a lot of damage amp, especially if you're playing around Vertical Dynamo. So some common holders of Dynamo Emblem, of course you can put on anybody, but there's many variations that involve Xayah with Dynamo Emblem, as many variations that involve Zeri with Dynamo Emblem. Now Zeri, she just generates a ton of mana because she's always casting, because she's just like auto attacking like crazy, rapid fire unit. And then Xayah works really well because the casting helps her to do her ult, and then Marksman, she gets a bunch of AD, so getting the damage amp is a great way to scale that, so it works out really well, and she has huge one-shot potential, especially as the fight goes on. When you're playing around these units, there's variations where usually you would play Dynamo with some of the other units. So for example, this is a variation of Zeri MF that is very common. So what you do is you play Zeri MF. Usually it's like if you have good exotech item like Pulse Stabilizer on Zeri and a frontline exotech. But if you have a Dynamo Emblem, this is really strong because the Dynamo Emblem gives this Zeri basically infinite damage amp, and she just goes nuts throughout the fight. So you basically build the Zeri the exact same way, Guinsoo, maybe even double Guinsoo, or Guinsoo and a damage item like a Guinsoo IE or Guinsoo Gunblade even for healing. And then you just scale up like crazy with the Dynamo emblem. And then MF items would be the same. And then you can cap out this board really high with 4 Dynamo on level 9. So this is one variation if you have a Dynamo emblem that you could look towards. Of course, you can make any sort of board, cook up all sorts of crazy stuff. I'm just trying to give you some general game plans to go for. Additionally, if you're maybe playing around Xayah, playing Xayah with Dynamo is actually really powerful, and what you can do is you can play your Vanguard Marksman board. Jin is a Dynamo unit. You now just give this Xayah an insane amount of damage amp. With this board, then you can cap out around Aurora, and even though you're not hitting 4 Dynamo, 3 Dynamo is still really powerful. Get Dynamo active on the whole team, and then you can also play around these units. Additionally, if you're playing this board that's very similar to another board, which was the one that we showed before, you can also substitute one of these units for Xayah. This works especially well if you don't have an Aurora early, because you can just play the Xayah in place of some of these units. So for example, you can drop Morgana, and you can just play this variation, which is the 4 Dynamo version, and you can play 2 Marksmen instead. This board is also extremely strong. And then you just play Jin, Xayah, and then you would have your Dynamo emblem on the Xayah, and then you can cap out high late game with some other units as well. And this is another variation of the same comp, very similar structure. You know, your 4 Vanguard, 3 Anima squad, except now you're playing Xayah with Marksman as a dual carry, and this works really well as an alternative to Vanguard Marksman if you don't hit like an Aphelios, for example. If you have like a bunch of AD items and you don't have an Aphelios, then you can just build your Xayah with your MF and play 4 Dynamo instead of 4 Marksman or something similar to that. But anyways, those are a bunch of variations that I just want to go through and talk about a little bit. So just make sure to try them out or see how they go. If we're talking about early game boards, however, early game boards, they can be very, very different. A lot of times, if you start out with an Elise, this Elise unit is extremely strong early game. I recommend that if you have an Elise, itemize her, and you could often win streak on stage 2, even with an Elise 1. So just Elise with general AP items are going to be extremely strong, and that can help you out. Obviously, if you're starting out the game with a Dynamo style board, you can just play a Dynamo board with Marksman and play around that pretty easily. Of course, that's totally valid, totally fine. Additionally, something that's really important is that this is a really valid flex option. MF items and Xayah items are actually very similar. So if you start your early game off with either Anima, like, you know, you're playing like some sort of Anima opener where you're making like, you know, AD Anima items, or if you're even playing around a Marksman style opener, you can very easily flex if you have like, you know, more of the Xayah items and less of the Aphelios items. You can easily play a board like this and then flex between playing Vanguard Marksman, which is a very popular comp, or playing Vanguard Dynamo, which is more of a tempo related comp. It's a little bit less stable because Vanguard Marksman is complete on level 8. Like I said before, this board, a lot of times you want to make it to level 9 because you want to fit in the extra unit for Syndicate or fit in 4 Vanguard, and usually you have to decide between the two of them. If you need more damage, you play the Syndicates because you want the MF to do more damage. If you need more frontline, then you play the 4 Vanguard. And if you don't have an Aurora, or if you think that you can just survive with 3 Dynamo instead of 4 Dynamo, like your units are casting and your frontline is tanking enough, then you can play 4 Vanguard, 3 Dynamo, and then just wait till level 9 to play the 4th Dynamo. So it comes down a lot to the matchups that you have and the boards that you're playing. But usually it's like if you have more of the Dynamo units, or if MF isn't your primary carry, like you have more AP items playing around Elise, then you would just play like the Vanguards and the Dynamos and then worry about Syndicate a little bit later. But anyways, like I said, lots of early game options into mid game. Like I said, a lot of times my big decision making process between what I'm playing usually comes down to if I see an Aurora. Aurora is so much more powerful for this board and does so much extra work. She helps stabilize the front line by summoning an extra unit, and she also does a shit ton of damage, and she also works really well with the 4 Dynamo trait. So if I do a roll down and I see an Aurora, often I will try and flex between Vanguard Marksman and Vanguard Dynamo, especially if I'm playing like, you know, for example, I'm playing Vanguard Marksman and I don't get like good Aphelios items, I have a bunch of AP items, then this is also a good pivot to just bail out of playing all AD style comp and just playing around your Dynamo units instead. But anyways, what are your conditions for success? So I kind of explained this throughout the video, but you usually want to be relatively uncontested. Like I said, this is a comp that requires some level of tempo if you're not playing one of the reroll lines. If you're playing the reroll lines, like the Elise or the Morgana rerolls, you need to be like uncontested. You don't want to be contested on a reroll because it's going to be really bad for you into your late game. So also, if you're playing the reroll lines, just know good reroll spot. You want to have items for the units early. You want to have a good potential to play around them into your late game, and you also want to have multiple copies of the units because you want to guarantee that you're actually going to hit instead of just hard forcing and just hoping for the best. Additionally, good enabling augments help out a lot. I talked about it a little bit. There is the Dynamo related augment that's good. Dynamo Emblem is also relatively strong because it's a really good emblem with a really good ability. Even stuff like reroll that helps you could work out really well with this comp. Even things like heroic grab bag, early tempo around Elise is really strong, or playing around the Elise with like just trying to hit an Elise 3 while you're playing the comp. These are all things that work really well, so there's lots of different options for you if you're trying out this comp. However, I personally wouldn't really angle towards, at least like the rerolls, obviously if you're a reroll spot you can play it, but I wouldn't really angle towards saying I'm going to go level 8 and play Dynamo this game. Right, the choice that I would make there is I would still have an option open. I would want to have an out, unless I'm playing like Elise reroll. I would only really angle myself towards this if I feel like I have a lot of tempo, right? I'm playing around units I already have, like I found early MF, I have Elise upgrade, etc. Or if I see an early Aurora, because if you don't have that 4 Dynamo and you can't make it to level 9, the board can be a little bit clumsy, and then you might be like, you know, hitting yourself and being like, oh man, I wish I just played like, you know, a simpler comp and just played for my placements instead. It does cap really high, it is really powerful, but I'm just always warning, be careful about those type of situations. It's not like, it's a sometimes food, not an always food, in my opinion. Additionally, same thing applies, right, as before. You want to play from ahead and try and make it to level 9, because it does help a lot to get all 4 of the things in, right? You want 4 Dynamo in, you want Anima in, you want Syndicate in, and you want 4 Vanguard in. I don't know if I repeated any of them, but there should be 4 things, right? That's like your little checklist. They actually help a lot in spiking and stabilizing your board for different reasons each. So actually having all of them ties the board together a lot better, and that's why it's a little bit clumsy on level 8, because you're going to have to sacrifice 1 or 2 of those things if you're staying on level 8 with this comp, which could in turn cause you to not, like, you know, get a proper placement in your game. But anyways, like I said, it's a really good pivot and angle option, especially if you have flexible items. Another thing that I should have noted a little bit before, this is something that's like, it shows up in the stats, but I don't know if it's super high roll or not, so I'm not going to recommend doing it instantly. But if you read the effect of, like, you know, what's it called? This item. Adaptive Helm, right? Adaptive Helm is a really flexible item. It works really well. Adaptive Helms, the timing on it, with gaining 10 mana every 3 seconds is actually very much in line with the Dynamo mana generation. So it actually is a really good item to make a lot of times if you're playing around the Dynamo units and you don't necessarily need to make like Shred because it uses Shred components. So it actually works really well. A lot of the units really like it, like Elise and Aurora like it because it's just a really effective way of getting additional mana, but also gives like stats, right? It gives 15 ability power plus the 10 that it comes with. And some extra resistances and starting mana. So Adaptive Helm is something that you might look at and say to yourself, that's pretty good, and then it can also work as a frontline unit, a frontline item, and it's a really good tempo slam early game for that reason. So if you're playing this comp from tempo, that's just another thing to keep in mind. I just remembered it because I was thinking about items. I didn't mention it earlier, so hopefully if you watched up until now, sorry that was a bit out of place, I missed that, but I just want to mention it very quickly. But not a priority. I wouldn't prioritize Adaptive Helm. With Dynamo, I think it just has a really good synergy, so it fits really well. And I think the stats also say that it's pretty good on a lot of the units. It's just not like giga broken, I would say. But anyways, if you like this video, thanks for watching. I'm actually going to put all of the how to play videos in a separate playlist because I realize I haven't done that on my channel. I've been super busy IRL, so things are finally calming down for me. I'm trying to get stuff working. The dog's coming back soon. I'm just trying to animate it because it's glitching out, so I don't want to put in the video and then have a bunch of comments saying, why is it like freaking out? Why is it like glitching out in the corner? So trying to fix that up for you guys, and then everything will be back to normal, kind of how it was before my computer exploded in April, because we're finally at a point now in my life where things are getting a little bit more normalized there. But thanks for watching. Item guides are coming soon. I'm just trying to find the time to do them and edit them in their proper versions, so that should be out either tomorrow or the day after. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye bye.